Crimson Circle. It all started when Jenny's boyfriend, Marcus, invited her to meet a group of friends he described as family. She had no idea what she was getting into. The place was remote, a cabin deep in the forest where cell service was non-existent, and the only sounds were the eerie howling of distant animals. At first, everyone seemed welcoming. They called themselves the Crimson Circle, a group of free spirits seeking a deeper connection with the earth. Jenny quickly noticed odd rituals, a daily chant, strict rules about speaking to outsiders, and an unsettling, almost hypnotic speech from the group leader, known only as the Shepherd. Marcus seemed different here, quieter, almost robotic in his movements and speech. She brushed it off, but something gnawed at her, especially as the others watched her every move. On the third night, during a strange midnight communion, the Shepherd insisted Jenny join them in a binding ritual. They led her to an underground chamber, lit only by dim, red-tinted candles. Inside, bizarre symbols were drawn on the walls, and a faint, sickly sweet smell filled the air. She wanted to leave, but Marcus held her tightly, whispering, "This is the only way you'll understand." In the candlelight, she could see others standing in a circle, staring at her with hollow, glassy eyes. They began to chant in a language she didn't recognize, louder and louder until the ground beneath her seemed to shake. Jenny struggled, demanding they let her go, but no one listened. Her heart pounded as they tied her wrists, forcing her to stand in the center of the circle. Suddenly, the Shepherd stepped forward, raising a blade. In that moment, she managed to break free, elbowing Marcus in the ribs and rushing toward the entrance. She stumbled through the dark woods, running until she saw lights from a passing car on a distant road. She flagged it down, escaping just in time. To this day, she can't shake the feeling that someone is watching her, waiting for her to return to the Crimson Circle. The Harvesters of Light. James had always been interested in the supernatural, so when he stumbled across a group online that claimed to be light seekers, he couldn't resist the invitation. Their meetings were held in an old barn on the outskirts of town. The first few gatherings were innocent enough, just meditation, energy practices, and talk of spiritual awakening. But after he joined their ranks, the tone shifted dramatically. The leader, a woman who called herself Mother Lenore, started talking about harvesting souls and offering light to the universe. James thought it was metaphorical at first, but the group's activities became darker with each meeting. They began to practice bizarre rituals late into the night, chanting, burning strange herbs, and speaking of ascending by leaving behind mortal ties. One night, Mother Lenore selected James for a special ceremony called the Gathering. Blindfolded and bound, he was led to a hidden basement beneath the barn, where he felt a chilling presence around him, cold hands, whispering voices, and a strange hum that seemed to vibrate through his bones. The members surrounded him, chanting in unison as they pressed their cold hands to his skin, mumbling something about transferring their essence into him. Then he felt it, a strange, intense pressure in his chest, as though something was being pulled out of him. Panic overtook him, and he fought against his bindings, breaking free and yanking the blindfold off just in time to see the hollow, soulless eyes of his fellow light seekers. Their faces were expressionless, like empty vessels, and their eyes glowed faintly, as if they were no longer human. James fled the barn and never looked back. The cult was gone the next day, the barn abandoned as if they had never been there. He still sees their faces in his dreams, especially Mother Lenore whispering that one day she'll come back to finish the ritual. The Hands of Eternity. In the isolated town of Willow's End, Lily found herself working on a farm as part of a seasonal job. The town was small, seemingly quiet, with fields that stretched on forever. The other workers seemed nice enough at first, but there was something peculiar about them. They all wore simple white clothes and whispered reverently about a group known as the Hands of Eternity. After a few days, they invited her to their service, held in a large abandoned chapel on the outskirts of town. As she entered, a strange feeling of dread washed over her. Flickering candlelight revealed grim, ancient-looking symbols carved into the walls. and a large cold stone altar sat at the center of the room. The leader, a stoic man named Ezra, spoke of reaching beyond and transcending the mortal coil. The service began with singing and chanting, but then something strange happened. The members started weeping and clutching at each other, their faces twisted in despair. Ezra explained they were preparing for the offering, a ritual where they would all transcend together. Before Lily could comprehend what was happening, she was grabbed by two of the cult members and forced onto the stone altar. Ezra held up an ancient book, chanting in a language that made her skin crawl, and the other cult members began a slow, eerie hum that filled the room. She struggled, screaming, but the sound was swallowed by their chanting. Just as Ezra raised a blade, the candle suddenly went out, plunging the chapel into darkness. The chanting stopped, replaced by gasps and frantic whispers. Lily scrambled off the altar, her heart pounding as chaos erupted around her. In the faint moonlight streaming through the broken windows, she could see Ezra's terrified face as he yelled for the others to complete the offering before it was too late. Lily didn't wait to find out what that meant. She darted out of the chapel and ran through the fields, only stopping when she reached the edge of town. The police found the chapel abandoned the next day, with no trace of the cult. But to this day, Lily can't shake the feeling that the hands of eternity are still watching her, waiting for her to finish what they started. I will never walk alone at night again. Here's what happened. It was a cold November night, and I was walking home from a friend's house after a small get-together. I had stayed a bit later than I intended, and by the time I left, it was nearly midnight. My neighborhood was usually pretty quiet, but the streets were unusually empty that night, with only the occasional distant hum of a car passing by. I wasn't too concerned at first. It was only a 10-minute walk back to my place, but I soon came to regret taking that shortcut. To save some time, I decided to cut through a narrow, poorly lit alleyway that ran between two rows of old apartment buildings. I had walked through it plenty of times during the day, but at night, it looked completely different. The darkness seemed to swallow up the light from the lone flickering street lamp in the middle of the alley, casting long, warped shadows against the walls. A gust of icy wind cut through my jacket, and I pulled it tighter around me, shivering as I picked up my pace. As I walked deeper into the alley, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. I felt like I was being watched. I tried to shake off the paranoia and kept moving, but then I heard it. Footsteps. Faint, but unmistakable, coming from somewhere behind me. I stopped and glanced back, but there was no one there, just the dark, empty alley stretching out behind me. I quickened my pace, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The footsteps came again, louder this time, as if whoever or whatever it was had gotten closer. I spun around, my eyes scanning the darkness, but there was still nothing. I stood there, my breath visible in the cold air, trying to calm the panic rising in my chest. It was just my imagination, I told myself, the echo of my own footsteps. I continued walking, almost at a jog now, when a voice cut through the silence. It was low and raspy, barely more than a whisper. "You're not alone." I froze, my skin prickling with fear. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the walls. I spun around, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the alley, just beyond the reach of the flickering street lamp, stood a tall figure cloaked in shadow. It was dressed in a long, dark coat that seemed to blend into the darkness, and its face was obscured by a hood. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand who it was and what it wanted, but the words stuck in my throat. The figure began to move slowly toward me, its footsteps echoing unnaturally loudly like they were right next to my ear. Panic surged through me, and I turned and ran. I sprinted back toward the main street, my footsteps pounding against the pavement, but the figure's footsteps seemed to match mine, as if it were right behind me. I could hear that same whispering voice now, though I couldn't make out the words. It was like a hiss, a chant almost, that grew louder and more frantic the faster I ran. As I reached the end of the alley and stumbled onto the main street, I dared to look back. The figure was gone. I slowed to a stop, gasping for breath, and scanned the empty street. My pulse was racing, but I was beginning to convince myself it was all just a weird trick of the shadows. That was until I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, movement in the window of a nearby building. I squinted up at the second-floor window of the old abandoned apartment complex that lined the alleyway. There, silhouetted against the faint light from inside, was the figure. It was watching me from the window, perfectly still. Its hood had fallen back slightly, revealing a face that wasn't entirely human. Pale, almost sickly gray skin stretched over gaunt features, and its eyes were completely black, like two endless voids. It tilted its head in an unnatural, jerky motion, as though studying me. My blood ran cold, and I took a step back, turning my gaze away from the window. When I looked back, the figure was gone. But before I could even process what was happening, a new sound reached my ears. Soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the ground beneath my feet. I looked down and saw a drain cover just a few feet away. The tapping was coming from underneath it, as though someone or something was trying to get out. I took several steps back, my mind racing with terror, when suddenly the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, thick with the kind of dread that made my skin crawl. Then, without warning, a hand reached out from the darkness of the drain, its fingers impossibly long and thin, grasping the edge of the cover. The hand was pale and bony, its nails sharp and stained dark. I stumbled back, almost tripping over myself as I saw the drain cover slowly being pushed aside. The whispers began again, louder this time, like a chorus of voices calling my name. I bolted toward my apartment, not daring to look back. The whispers seemed to follow me, growing more frenzied as I approached my building. I fumbled with my keys in a panic, practically bursting through the door and slamming it shut behind me. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any sound, any indication that it, or they, had followed me. But there was nothing. Just the hollow echo of my own breathing in the dark hallway. I peered through the peephole, scanning the empty street outside. The alley was dark, still, and seemingly devoid of life. But then, just as I was about to step away, I saw it again. The figure was standing under the flickering street lamp across the street, its black eyes locked onto me. It lifted its hand slowly, pointing directly at my apartment. I felt a chill run down my spine as the light above it flickered and then went out, plunging the street into darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the lights on and stayed as far away from the windows as possible. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it was all just a nightmare, a figment of my imagination brought on by the late hour and the unsettling alley. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just a trick of the mind. Whatever that thing was, it was real. A few days later, I found a note slipped under my door. It was written in jagged, erratic handwriting, and it contained just 4 words: "You belong to us." I haven't walked alone at night since, and I've moved to a different part of the city. But sometimes I still hear that voice in my dreams, whispering my name, calling me back to that alley. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I can feel a pair of cold, empty eyes watching me from the shadows. The Basement Ritual. During my senior year, I was part of a small, close-knit group of friends who were all fascinated by the paranormal. We'd often go ghost hunting in abandoned buildings or visit allegedly haunted places near campus. One night, we heard about an old, unused basement under one of the oldest lecture halls on campus. It was rumored to be haunted, and since it was the end of the semester, we thought we'd check it out for fun. The basement was officially off limits, but we managed to find an old service entrance that wasn't locked. As we descended the creaky stairs, the air grew colder, and the faint smell of mildew filled our noses. The basement was pitch dark, and we had to use our phone flashlights to see. As we explored the dank, narrow corridors, we stumbled upon a heavy, rusted door at the far end of the basement. It was partially open, and behind it was a large, dimly lit room that looked like an old storage area. But there was something else in the room, an arrangement of old wooden chairs set in a circle, with strange symbols painted on the floor. In the middle of the circle lay what looked like an old, worn-out book. We were all uneasy, but curiosity got the better of us. One of my friends, Chris, picked up the book and started flipping through the pages. It was filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, and strange symbols. As he read aloud from one of the pages, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further, and a faint whisper echoed through the basement. Suddenly, the heavy door slammed shut behind us, making us all jump. We tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as the whispers grew louder, and we could hear faint footsteps approaching from somewhere in the darkness. We frantically searched for another way out when Chris stumbled and dropped the book, sending a cloud of dust into the air. At that moment, the whispers stopped and everything went silent. Then, a deep guttural voice echoed through the room saying, "You shouldn't be here." The lights on our phones began to flicker, and a dark figure appeared in the corner, slowly advancing toward us. We finally managed to force the door open and ran up the stairs as fast as we could, not looking back. When we reached the surface, we locked the service entrance behind us and sprinted back to our dorms. We never spoke of that night again, but Chris kept the book, despite our warnings to get rid of it. A few weeks later, Chris started acting strange. He became withdrawn, claiming he could hear the whispers even when he was alone. He started missing classes, and eventually dropped out before graduation. The last time I saw him, he looked haunted, like he had been living a nightmare that never ended. None of us ever went back to that basement. It remained sealed off, but every now and then, students whisper about strange sounds and cold drafts coming from below, like something still lingers down there, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too deep. The Late Night Stalker. During my sophomore year in college, I lived off campus in a small apartment complex about a 15-minute walk from the main campus. It was a quiet area, mostly students living there, and I felt safe. That was until one night when I was walking back from a late-night study session at the library. It was nearly 1 a.m., and the campus was almost deserted. As I walked down the dark street toward my apartment, I noticed a figure standing at the far end of the road. The person was barely visible under the dim streetlight, but it seemed like they were staring right at me. I thought it was a bit odd, but I brushed it off and kept walking. As I passed under the streetlight, I glanced back to see if the person was still there, but they were gone. I felt a little uneasy, but I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. Then, as I turned the corner to my apartment complex, I heard footsteps behind me. I looked back again and saw the same figure walking down the street, slowly but deliberately. My heart started racing. I quickened my pace, and so did the footsteps behind me. I was almost at my apartment door when I turned around again and saw the figure much closer now, his face barely illuminated by the flickering light above the door. It was a man, tall and thin, with dark clothes that seemed to blend into the night. His eyes were wide, and there was a twisted grin on his face. I hurriedly unlocked my apartment door, slammed it shut behind me, and locked it. I peeked through the peephole, but the man was gone. I checked all the windows and made sure everything was locked before heading to bed. I had almost convinced myself it was just some creep messing around when I heard it, a faint tapping on my window. My stomach sank as I crept toward the window, barely pulling back the curtain to look outside. The man was standing there right outside my window, staring at me with that same twisted grin. I froze in terror as he slowly raised his hand and pointed directly at me. I pulled the curtain shut and backed away, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. They searched the area but found no trace of him. For the next week, I stayed with friends, too terrified to sleep in my apartment. When I finally went back, I found a note slipped under my door. It was a single piece of paper with one sentence written on it. "I know where you live." I moved out the following month, and I haven't walked home alone at night since. The Haunted Dorm Room. I was a freshman at a small college in the Midwest. The dorms were old and had been around since the 1950s. I was assigned to a room on the third floor, and although it was small and a little run down, I was excited to start the semester. Everything was fine for the first few weeks. I quickly made friends, adjusted to my classes, and even joined a couple of clubs. But then, strange things began happening in my dorm room. It started with small, unexplainable incidents. One night I woke up to the sound of faint tapping on the wall behind my bed. I thought it was just the pipes, or maybe someone in the next room. But when I asked my neighbor the next day, he said he hadn't heard anything. A few nights later, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard the tapping again. This time it was coming from the closet. I got up and opened the closet door, expecting to find some kind of animal or maybe something that had fallen, but it was completely empty. I brushed it off, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. Things escalated quickly after that. I started waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone whispering. The voice was faint and muffled, like it was coming from inside the walls. I could never make out the words, but it sounded like someone pleading or crying. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination or stress from school. One night, however, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I woke up suddenly, and there was a cold breeze in the room, even though the window was shut. My eyes darted to the closet door, which was now slightly open, even though I always kept it closed. As I stared at it, the whispering began again, soft and desperate. My heart pounded in my chest as I got out of bed and walked slowly toward the closet. As I reached for the door, the whispering stopped. I yanked the door open, and there, huddled in the back of the closet, was a shadowy figure. Its form was vague and dark, but I could see its eyes, pale and empty, staring directly at me. I stumbled backward, slamming the door shut, and ran out of the room. I didn't go back that night. I crashed at a friend's dorm and told him everything. The next morning, we went to the dorm supervisor and explained what happened. To my surprise, she didn't seem shocked at all. In fact, she seemed reluctant to talk about it. After some pressing, she finally admitted that there had been incidents in that room before. A few years ago, a student had died in that very room, an apparent suicide. I moved out the next day and I haven't set foot in that building since. But even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear faint whispering like the voice followed me out. The abandoned oil rig. A few years ago, I was working as a deep-sea welder, hired to inspect and repair underwater structures. My latest assignment took me to an abandoned oil rig in the North Sea. The rig had been decommissioned for over a decade, and now it was just a rusting hulk surrounded by cold, dark water. The job was supposed to be straightforward: descend to the base of the rig, inspect the supports, and repair any structural damage. As I dropped into the water, the rig loomed above me like a ghost, its massive metal legs vanishing into the black abyss below. As I descended to the rig's base, I noticed something strange. The water seemed to grow darker, even with the powerful lights on my helmet. It was like a cloud of ink was spreading through the water, making it hard to see. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the darkness became, and I could swear I heard faint whispers, though I told myself it was just the current playing tricks on my ears. Reaching the lowest part of the rig, I started my inspection. The metal was corroded and covered in barnacles, but something else caught my eye: long, deep gouges in the steel, as if something with enormous claws had raked across it. I tried to brush it off, focusing on my task, but a nagging feeling of being watched crept over me. Then I saw it. Just beyond the beam of my light, something moved. It was too large to be a fish. Its body was slender and unnaturally long, disappearing into the darkness. I shined my light toward it, and for a brief moment, I saw what looked like a pale, human-like face, staring back at me from the shadows, its eyes reflecting the light with an eerie glow. I felt a chill run down my spine and quickly turned to ascend, but before I could move, the creature darted forward, its elongated arms stretching toward me. It wasn't a person. Its skin was a sickly gray, covered in scales, and its mouth opened to reveal rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. I kicked away and began to ascend as fast as I could. The creature followed, its long limbs propelling it through the water with unnatural speed. I could feel it getting closer, the water around me growing colder as it closed the distance. Just as I was nearing the surface, I felt a sharp pain in my leg. The creature's claw had grazed me, tearing through the fabric of my diving suit. I thrashed and kicked desperately, breaking the surface and pulling myself onto the platform above. I turned back to the water just in time to see the creature slip back into the darkness below, its pale face vanishing into the abyss. When I made it back onto the rig, I inspected my leg. A deep scratch ran down my calf, and the fabric around it was shredded. The company dismissed my report, claiming it was likely a large fish or a trick of the light. But I knew what I saw. There was something down there, something unnatural, and whatever it was, it didn't want me near that oil rig. The deep-sea creature. I was part of a marine biology research team that specialized in studying life at extreme ocean depths. We were stationed on a research vessel off the coast of Japan, where we planned to explore one of the deepest parts of the ocean, the Mariana Trench. The descent into the trench took hours, and as we descended, I couldn't help but feel the overwhelming weight of the ocean pressing down on us. The submersible was equipped with bright lights and a high-definition camera, which streamed back to the ship in real time. At nearly 36,000 feet, we reached the ocean floor, where the landscape was alien, dark, and barren, with scattered hydrothermal vents releasing plumes of hot water. We had been surveying the area for about an hour, when something unusual appeared on the monitor. A large shape, almost the size of our submersible, moving slowly in the distance. It looked like nothing we had documented before. It had a long serpentine body covered in translucent, gelatinous skin that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Its eyes, black and soulless, stared directly into the camera. We tried to steer the submersible closer to get a better look, but as soon as we did, the creature darted away with startling speed. My colleague Mark, who was piloting the sub, tried to follow it, but the creature seemed to disappear into the pitch-black void. Just as we were about to give up, a thud echoed through the hull, followed by another. The submersible shook as if something massive was hitting it from outside. The lights flickered, and the camera feed briefly cut out. When it returned, the creature was no longer in the distance. It was right in front of us, staring into the viewport. Its mouth opened slowly, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. And then, without warning, it lunged at the submersible, slamming into the viewport with a force that nearly cracked the glass. Mark scrambled to ascend, desperate to put distance between us and whatever this thing was. As we rose, the creature followed, circling the sub like a predator playing with its prey. It let out a sound, a deep rumbling noise that resonated through the water, making our bones vibrate. The lights flickered again, and for a moment, we were plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the creature was gone. We raced to the surface, but the sense of dread lingered. When we reached the ship, the exterior of the submersible was covered in deep scratches, and sections of the metal were bent inward, as if something had tried to tear it apart. We reviewed the footage, hoping to find an explanation, but the video was corrupted, nothing but static and garbled images. The scientists dismissed it as a technical malfunction, but Mark and I knew what we saw, and whatever that thing was, it was still out there, lurking in the darkest depths of the ocean. The unmarked submarine. It was the summer of 2015, and I had been working as a deep-sea diver for a private company that conducted underwater surveys. We were far out in the Atlantic, investigating a newly discovered shipwreck that lay almost 500 meters below the surface. The ocean at that depth was pitch black, and the water seemed to swallow the light from our diving gear. Our team consisted of 3 divers, each equipped with cameras to document the wreck. It was an old ship, mostly rotted away, but still intriguing enough to keep us combing through the debris. As we carefully explored the wreck, my flashlight beam caught something unusual, something that didn't belong. Just beyond the edge of the shipwreck, I saw the faint outline of a large cylindrical shape. I swam closer, my curiosity growing with each stroke. It was a submarine, an old one. The hull was covered in algae and barnacles, and there were no markings or serial numbers on it. It was as if the ocean had erased its identity. I called over my teammates, who swam toward the submarine to inspect it. As we circled the structure, we noticed the submarine's hatch was slightly ajar, an ominous gap that led into complete darkness. One of my colleagues, Ian, suggested we go inside to take a look. Despite my unease, I agreed, figuring it could lead to a significant discovery. We squeezed through the narrow hatch and into the submarine's interior. The place was in ruins. Rust covered the walls, and debris floated around us. We ventured deeper inside, our flashlights cutting through the thick, murky water. The further we went, the more we noticed an odd sensation. The temperature seemed to drop dramatically, and a strange pressure pushed against us, making it feel like we were being squeezed from all directions. As we reached what looked like the control room, Ian's flashlight beam suddenly flickered and died. The darkness swallowed him in an instant, and I felt panic surge through me. "Ian, are you all right?" I shouted into the comms, but there was no response. Then I heard a sound, something like a low, vibrating hum resonating from deeper within the submarine. It was rhythmic, almost like chanting. My remaining teammate, Jessica, began to breathe heavily over the comms, her voice trembling. I think I see something moving," she whispered. Before I could ask what she meant, a sudden force knocked me sideways. My flashlight spun through the water, casting chaotic shadows against the rusted walls. That's when I saw them, dark figures floating just beyond the edge of the light. They weren't fish or any kind of marine life I'd ever seen. They were humanoid shapes, featureless, moving toward us with an unnatural jerking motion. Jessica screamed through the comms, and I could hear Ian's voice again, but he was muttering something incoherent, like he was in a trance. I turned and swam for the hatch as fast as I could, not daring to look back. Jessica was right behind me, but as we neared the exit, I felt a hand, ice cold, wrap around my ankle. I kicked desperately, managing to free myself, and burst out of the submarine. I swam toward the surface, my lungs burning and my heart racing. When we reached the boat, I looked around for Ian, but he never surfaced. The search team combed the area for hours but found no trace of him. The submarine was sealed off afterward, left to rot in the darkness where it belonged. But every now and then, divers in the area report hearing a faint humming sound coming from the depths below, as if the sea itself was whispering of the horrors that lay in its black waters. The abandoned school. During my senior year, my friends and I decided to do something memorable on the last day of school. There was an abandoned elementary school on the outskirts of town, notorious for being haunted. It had been shut down for nearly 15 years, and rumors swirled about why it was left to decay. Some said it was because of a fire, others whispered about a tragic event. We thought it would be thrilling to break in and explore, even though it was a gray, stormy afternoon. We parked near the back entrance where a fence had fallen over and climbed through a broken window. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, with a faint smell of mold. Dust covered everything: the desks, the chalkboards, and the forgotten school supplies left behind. As we wandered the dark halls, our flashlights barely pierced the gloom. The place was eerily quiet except for the occasional creaking sound, like the building itself was breathing. We decided to split up to cover more ground. 2 of us went to explore the classrooms while the other 2 went towards the gym. Not long after, my friend and I heard a faint tapping sound coming from one of the classrooms. We turned off our flashlights and listened. The tapping grew louder, like someone was rhythmically knocking on a desk. My friend whispered, "Let's go check it out." We tiptoed down the hall and peeked into the room where the sound was coming from. To our shock, there was a desk in the middle of the room, and the lid was slowly opening and closing on its own, as if someone invisible was lifting it. Suddenly it slammed shut, and we heard a faint, childlike giggle echo through the empty halls. We spun around and sprinted back towards the gym to find our other friends. But when we reached the gym doors, we found them ajar, swinging slowly. The gym was pitch black, and as we stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind us. In the darkness, we saw a figure at the far end of the gym. It was small, child-sized, and it stood perfectly still. "Hey, is someone there?" my friend shouted. But as we took a step forward, the figure darted away into the shadows. We followed, adrenaline rushing through us, but as we turned a corner into the locker rooms, we found nothing but silence. The lights suddenly flickered, revealing dozens of tiny handprints on the walls, dusty, as if left by children years ago. We froze in terror as we realized they weren't there before. We didn't waste another second. We sprinted back the way we came and climbed out the window. It wasn't until we were safely back in the car that we noticed my friend had a small, dusty handprint on his shoulder. The school was torn down later that year, but to this day, I wonder what we would have found if we had stayed inside just a little longer. The creepy note. The last day of sophomore year was always a bit chaotic. Everyone left the campus as soon as possible, eager for summer vacation. But before the final bell rang, something strange happened. When I went to my locker to grab my things, I found a folded piece of paper stuffed into the slats of the locker door. At first I thought it was a joke from one of my friends, a silly note saying goodbye for the summer. But as I unfolded it, my smile faded. The message was written in uneven, frantic handwriting that read, "Meet me behind the gym after school. Come alone." My heart skipped a beat. I had no idea who would leave such a note, and the thought of going behind the gym alone after school made my skin crawl. I told my friends about the note, and we decided it was probably some prankster trying to scare people. Still, curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to check it out together. After the final bell, the school grounds emptied quickly. The overcast sky and approaching storm made the atmosphere even eerier. As we made our way to the gym, an uneasy feeling settled over us. The air felt colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. When we rounded the corner of the gym, we saw him, an older man standing in the shadows, dressed in a dirty gray jacket that looked soaked from the drizzle. His back was turned to us, his head slightly lowered. We stopped in our tracks, staring at him in silence. I had no idea who he was, but something about him felt wrong, like he didn't belong there. Suddenly he turned around, his face partially obscured by a hood. He didn't look like a teacher or any janitor I'd ever seen. There was something unsettling about the way his eyes fixed on us. It was as if he was studying us, weighing his options. My friend nervously called out, "Do you work here?" There was no answer, just the sound of the rain picking up. The man took a step forward, and a crooked smile spread across his face. "I'm glad you showed up," he said. His voice was rough and low, like he hadn't spoken in a long time. The tension broke in an instant, and we all bolted, running as fast as we could back towards the main building. We didn't stop until we were inside and locked the door behind us. We told the principal about the man, and the police were called. But by the time they arrived, the man had vanished. They searched the area but found no trace of him. For weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I kept imagining that strange man standing outside my window, waiting for the day when I would be alone again. The stranger at the school gates. It was the last day of 4th grade, and excitement buzzed in the air as students ran through the halls, eager to begin summer vacation. My best friend Chris and I had plans to hang out after school to celebrate. We'd been friends since kindergarten, and every year our parents took us out for ice cream on the last day. This time, Chris's dad had promised to pick us up together. The bell rang, and kids rushed out of the classrooms, flooding the exit doors. I waited by the school gates, scanning the crowd for Chris's dad, but I didn't see him. A man approached me instead, someone I didn't recognize. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face and sunglasses, even though it was an overcast day. I noticed his car keys dangling from his fingers as he gave me a friendly wave. "Hey, Tommy," he said. "Chris's dad asked me to pick you up today. He got held up at work. I hesitated. I had never met this man before. Where's Chris?" I asked, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. The man's smile didn't fade, but his eyes didn't seem to match the expression on his face. "He's already in the car. Come on, I'll take you to him." Something didn't feel right, and as I took a step back, my teacher, Mrs. Bennett, approached us. "Tommy, do you know this man?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. I glanced at the man, who gave Mrs. Bennett a nod and said, "I'm Chris's uncle." He motioned towards the parking lot. "I'm here to take him and Chris for ice cream." Mrs. Bennett looked at me with a raised eyebrow, and I wasn't sure what to say. After all, he did know Chris's name and mine. She seemed satisfied when I nodded and gave me a gentle pat on the back. "Okay, Tommy, stay safe." But as I followed the man to his car, the uneasiness crept back in. His car was parked further away than all the other parents' cars, almost hidden behind some tall bushes. When we reached the vehicle, my anxiety spiked. It wasn't the familiar blue SUV that Chris's dad drove. It was an old, beat-up van with the windows tinted so dark you couldn't see inside. "Get in," the man said, his tone a little more urgent now. I froze. "Where's Chris?" I demanded. His smile faded, replaced by a cold, impatient stare. "Get in the van, Tommy." Before I could react, he lunged forward and grabbed my wrist. I twisted away and let out the loudest scream I could muster, jerking my arm out of his grip. I stumbled back, just as Mrs. Bennett's voice shouted from behind me, "Hey, what's going on?" The man's expression twisted with frustration and he bolted towards the van. I ran back to Mrs. Bennett, who was already dialing 911 on her phone. I turned back in time to see the man's van speed away, tires screeching as he disappeared down the street. Later, we found out that Chris's dad hadn't arranged for anyone to pick me up. The police searched for the van but never found it. And to this day, I don't know who that man was or how he knew my name. All I know is that he had no intention of taking me to get ice cream. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, a chance for me and my friends to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life and enjoy some quiet time in nature. We'd rented a cabin deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, with no cell service and only a narrow dirt road leading in and out. It sounded perfect, or so we thought. There were 4 of us, me, Ryan, Alex, and Jen. We were all used to city life, and the idea of spending a couple of nights in a remote cabin sounded adventurous. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, driving up the lonely road lined with tall, ancient trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. When we finally saw the cabin, it looked exactly as advertised. A rustic log cabin with a small porch, surrounded by nothing but dense forest as far as the eye could see. As we settled in, the sense of isolation became very real. There was no electricity, just a wood-burning stove and some old oil lamps scattered throughout the cabin. It was quaint and charming in the daylight, but as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched across the forest floor, the atmosphere shifted. It became unsettling. That first night, we built a fire in the cabin's stone fireplace and played cards by the light of the oil lamps. It was fun at first, but soon enough, we began to notice strange sounds outside. Soft rustling in the bushes, branches snapping in the distance. We brushed it off as animals, though a nervous tension settled over us. We were city kids after all, not used to the sounds of the forest. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, I heard what sounded like faint whispering coming from the woods. I froze, straining my ears to listen, but it stopped as suddenly as it started. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was off. The next morning, Ryan and I decided to go for a hike, while Alex and Jen stayed behind. We followed a narrow trail that twisted through the thick forest, our boots crunching on the dry leaves. The further we went, the more uneasy I felt, like we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was never anyone there, just the endless stretch of trees. About an hour in, we stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. In the middle of a small clearing stood a circle of stone cairns, stacked rocks arranged in a deliberate pattern. There were 7 of them, all different sizes, some standing as tall as my waist, others barely reaching my knees. But that wasn't the strangest part. Each cairn had wooden carvings placed on top, crude, human-like figures with hollow eyes and twisted expressions. It was like some kind of ritual site hidden deep in the forest. Ryan, being the skeptic he was, laughed it off. Probably some weird art project, he said, but I felt a chill creep up my spine. The air was colder here, and the silence was unnerving, almost suffocating. I took a picture of the site with my phone, thinking it would be a funny story to share later, and we continued our hike. When we got back to the cabin, things felt different. Alex and Jen were quiet, almost on edge. They said they'd been hearing strange noises all day, footsteps outside the cabin, branches snapping, faint whispers. At first, we laughed it off, chalking it up to our imaginations. But as night fell, those sounds only grew louder. It was around midnight when things took a turn for the worse. We were all in the living room talking about the strange noises when the power cut out. The only light came from the dim glow of the fireplace. Jen grabbed one of the oil lamps and lit it, and as soon as the flame flickered to life, we heard a loud bang on the side of the cabin, like something heavy had slammed against the wall. Ryan jumped up and flung open the door, but there was nothing there, just the darkness of the woods and the faint rustle of the leaves. We decided to stay inside for the rest of the night, each of us taking turns to keep watch while the others tried to get some sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. At around 3 a.m., I was sitting by the window when I saw something moving in the woods. It was just a shadow at first, barely visible in the moonlight. But then it came closer, stepping out from behind the trees. It was a figure, a person, or at least it looked like one. They stood there perfectly still, just beyond the tree line, watching the cabin. My heart raced as I tried to make out any details, but their face was hidden in the shadows. I called out to Ryan, who grabbed the flashlight and shined it towards the figure, but by the time the beam hit the spot, they were gone. It was as if they had disappeared into thin air. We searched the perimeter of the cabin, but there were no signs of anyone. That night was a blur of fear and confusion. We barely slept, and as soon as the first light of dawn appeared, we packed up our things, ready to get the hell out of there. But as we were loading the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold once again. There, right outside the cabin's front door, was a small stone cairn. It hadn't been there the night before. The wooden carving on top was different from the ones we had seen in the woods. This one was much smaller, crudely shaped, and had hollow eyes staring up at us. We didn't stick around to find out who, or what, had left it there. We drove back to town as fast as we could, and I swear I didn't breathe easy until we were miles away from that cabin. For weeks after, I kept thinking about the experience. I showed the picture of the stone cairns to a local historian, hoping to get some answers. But what he told me only deepened my fear. He said the cairns were markers used by an old, secretive group that had lived in the area over a century ago. According to local legend, they used the cairns as warning signs, marking places where evil spirits were said to dwell. And the carvings? He said they were effigies, representations of people who had gone missing in the woods, supposedly taken by those spirits. I still can't explain what we experienced at that cabin. I've tried to convince myself it was just an overactive imagination, or some elaborate prank. But every now and then when I'm alone at night, I think about the whispers I heard in the woods, and the figure standing just outside the tree line. And I wonder, what would have happened if we had stayed one more night? The graveyard shift. I used to work the graveyard shift at a gas station off the highway. It wasn't the safest area, but it was quiet most nights, just me and the hum of the coolers. I'd spend the nights reading or scrolling through my phone, keeping an eye out for the occasional customer who wandered in. But one night something happened that still sends chills down my spine. It was just after 3 a.m., and I hadn't seen a car for hours. I was behind the counter, half asleep, when I heard a faint tapping on the glass door. I looked up, expecting to see someone standing outside, but there was no one there. I chalked it up to the wind or some loose sign rattling in the breeze and went back to scrolling on my phone. A few minutes later, the tapping came again, louder this time. I walked to the front of the store, peering out into the empty parking lot, but there was no one around. That's when I noticed something strange. The lights in the parking lot were flickering, casting long, eerie shadows across the asphalt. It felt like the darkness was alive, closing in around the station. I turned to head back inside, but stopped dead in my tracks. In the reflection of the glass door, I saw someone standing behind me. My breath hitched and I spun around, but there was no one there, just empty aisles and rows of snacks. I tried to shake it off, but the unease was growing stronger, like I was being watched. I returned to the counter, checking the security monitors to calm my nerves. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the camera's view, just outside the range of the parking lot lights. It was a tall, shadowy shape, almost human-like but too thin, its limbs unnaturally long. I stared at the monitor, frozen in fear. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Then, as if sensing my gaze, it started walking toward the gas station, slowly, deliberately. I reached under the counter, my hand trembling as I grabbed the emergency phone to call the police. I dialed 911, but as I looked back at the screen, the figure was gone. There was no sign of it anywhere. The police arrived not long after, but they found nothing unusual. No one was around, and there were no signs of anyone having been there. But I know what I saw. Ever since that night, I haven't been able to work the graveyard shift without feeling that cold gaze on the back of my neck. The security guard's visitor. I used to work as a security guard for an office building downtown. The place was dead quiet at night, just me, the rows of darkened cubicles, and the occasional buzz of a flickering fluorescent light. It seemed like an easy job at first, just doing my rounds, making sure everything was locked up and watching the surveillance monitors. But that was before the night I saw her. It was a little past 2 a.m., and I was doing my usual patrol when I noticed something strange on the security cameras. A flicker of movement on the second floor. I zoomed in, thinking it was a trick of the light or a bug crawling across the lens. But then I saw it. A woman. She was standing completely still in the middle of the hallway, facing away from the camera. Her long hair hung down, obscuring her face, and she was dressed in a thin, white gown that looked out of place for the time of year. I radioed in to see if there were any cleaning staff scheduled for the night. Nothing. I called out, "Hello?" hoping it was just a mistake, but she didn't respond. I hesitated for a moment before heading up to the second floor to check it out in person. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and I stepped out into the darkened hallway, my flashlight cutting through the shadows. The air was cold, much colder than it should have been, and the silence was unnerving. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing off the walls. I reached the spot where I'd seen her on the camera. Empty. There was no sign of the woman. I turned around, preparing to head back downstairs, when suddenly I heard a noise. A faint, dragging sound coming from one of the nearby offices. I shone my flashlight down the hall, and there she was again, just a few feet away, standing in the doorway. Her head was tilted slightly to the side, and I could see her pale face now, eyes wide open but unblinking. My heart raced as I asked, "Are you okay, ma'am?" But she didn't move. She just stared at me, like she was waiting for something. And then, she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was a twisted, too wide grin that stretched her lips back unnaturally. The air grew colder, and I took a step back. In that instant, the lights flickered, and when they came back on, she was gone. I searched every room on that floor, but there was no sign of anyone. I went back to the security room and rewound the footage, hoping to find an explanation, but there was nothing there. It was as if she had never been on the camera at all. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that faint dragging sound echoing down the hall.
The Bell Witch. My terrifying encounter. I grew up in a small town in Tennessee, not far from where the infamous Bell Witch legend was born. As a kid, I had heard the stories, how the Bell family was tormented by a malevolent spirit in the early 1800s. The witch was said to be a vengeful entity, full of hatred and capable of unspeakable horrors. It was just a legend, or so I thought. That all changed one summer night when I was 17. My friends and I were the kind of kids who dared each other to do dumb things, especially when it came to local ghost stories. One night, as we were hanging out in the woods behind my house, the conversation inevitably turned to the Bell Witch. Everyone had a story, but none of us had experienced anything firsthand. That's when someone suggested we visit the site, the place where the Bell Witch haunted the Bell family. It sounded exciting at first, like the perfect adrenaline rush. I didn't believe in ghosts, but something about the Bell Witch legend had always given me a bad feeling. Still, the challenge was too tempting to pass up. We made our plans for the next night, setting out around dusk. We drove through the winding back roads, the sky growing darker by the minute as we approached the old Bell Witch Cave. An eerie, moss-covered cave hidden deep in the woods near the original Bell farm. The air was heavy, humid, and full of tension. We all felt it, though no one said a word. When we arrived, we parked the car on the side of the road and trekked through the woods, flashlights in hand, the trees pressing in on us like dark sentinels. The further we walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The woods were unnervingly quiet. No crickets, no wind, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the leaves and branches beneath us. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We reached the mouth of the cave just as night fully descended. The entrance was small and overgrown with vines, barely visible unless you knew where to look. We stood in silence, staring at the black hole in the earth. The stories had said the witch dwelled in this cave, and the closer we got, the more we felt her presence. An overwhelming, almost suffocating pressure in the air. No one wanted to admit it, but we were scared, terrified. Still, we pressed on, daring each other to explore the cave. As we stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop instantly. The light from our flashlights flickered weakly against the cave walls, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. The deeper we went, the narrower the passage became, the air growing colder and thicker. I swear, it felt like we were walking into the mouth of something ancient and evil. Then we heard it, the sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It started as a soft, distant whisper. At first, we thought it was one of us playing a trick, but as we all looked around, our faces illuminated by the faint glow of our flashlights, we realized no one was laughing. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and it wasn't just one voice. It was many, layered, distorted, and angry. It was like they were coming from everywhere at once, bouncing off the cave walls, closing in on us. "Let's go," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the growing chorus of whispers. But before we could move, the flashlights flickered again, and then went out completely, plunging us into complete darkness. We were trapped in the pitch black, the whispers growing louder, almost deafening. It was as if the cave itself was alive, breathing with malevolent energy. My heart pounded in my chest, and I fumbled for my phone, desperately trying to turn on its flashlight. But then I felt it. Cold fingers. They wrapped around my wrist, icy and bony, tightening with unnatural strength. I screamed, jerking my arm away, but when I shone my phone's weak light on my wrist, there was nothing there. Nothing but the deep red marks left by invisible hands. Before I could warn the others, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the cave, cutting through the whispers like a knife. It was a sound no human throat could make, low, rumbling, and filled with hatred. We scrambled, pushing past each other in the darkness, desperate to get out of the cave. The growling followed us, the whispers morphing into high-pitched laughter, mocking us, taunting us. As we neared the entrance, the cave seemed to close in on us, the walls shifting, the ground beneath our feet unsteady. I stumbled, and when I looked up, I saw her, the Bell Witch. She stood at the mouth of the cave, her figure barely visible in the moonlight, a twisted silhouette of what once might have been a woman. Her face was pale, her eyes black and hollow, staring straight through me. Her mouth curled into a sinister smile, and as she opened it, I heard a voice. Her voice. The same voice I had heard in the whispers. "You shouldn't have come," she hissed, her voice crawling under my skin like ice. I ran. I don't remember how I made it out of the cave, but I ran faster than I ever have in my life. We all did. We didn't stop until we were back at the car, gasping for breath, our hearts hammering in our chests. No one spoke on the drive home, and I knew that we had seen something that night. Something real. For days after, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, her empty, black eyes staring into my soul. And the worst part? The calls started soon after. Just like the old legend, my phone would ring at midnight, the screen flashing no caller ID. I'd answer, but there was no one there. Just the sound of breathing, soft and deliberate. It's been years since that night, but the Bell Witch still haunts me. I feel her presence in the darkest hours of the night, hear her whispers in the silence. And I know, deep down, that I'll never escape her. The Bell Witch doesn't just haunt the Bell family. She haunts anyone foolish enough to seek her out. The Midnight Caller. The first time it happened, I didn't think much of it. The clock struck midnight, and my phone vibrated softly on my nightstand. I assumed it was a wrong number, a simple mistake, so I ignored it. But when the calls kept coming, always at the exact same time, midnight, I started to feel uneasy. For the first few nights, I let it go. No voicemail, no messages, just silence on the other end. But as the nights bled into one another, the calls became something more, something that crawled under my skin and lingered in the back of my mind. Every night, like clockwork, the phone would ring, and every night I'd answer, only to be met with the same eerie silence, like someone was there, listening, watching. Weeks passed, and the calls didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent, more insistent. My sleep became restless, my nights long and filled with dread. The anticipation of the call gnawed at me, and soon enough, I was no longer just waiting for it, I was fearing it. Who was on the other end? Why wouldn't they speak? One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I was already sleep-deprived, on edge, and just when I thought I could rest, the phone rang again. Midnight, right on time. With a heavy heart and trembling hands, I answered, bracing myself for the usual silence. But this time it was different. A woman's voice, a soft, almost seductive whisper drifted through the static. "Come find me," she said, her tone a mix of urgency and something darker. Something wrong. My chest tightened, fear prickling at my skin. "Who are you?" I whispered, but she was already gone, the line dead. That voice haunted me. For days I replayed it over and over in my head, trying to rationalize it, but nothing made sense. Every night after, the calls continued. Sometimes she'd speak, other times it was just the heavy, suffocating silence. But one thing was clear. She was waiting for me. And as the days passed, my curiosity, twisted with fear, grew unbearable. I had to know. I had to face it. On a cold, moonless night, I made my decision. I would answer her summons. With shaking hands, I waited for the call, and when midnight came, I heard her voice again, whispering instructions that felt more like a curse. "Come, you know where." I didn't know how, but I did, I felt it deep in my bones, a pull, a compulsion that led me outside, into the freezing night. The streets were silent, bathed in a thick, oppressive fog. There was no one out, no cars, no life, just me, and the voice that echoed in my head. I followed her call, each step feeling heavier than the last, the weight of dread growing with every moment. The streets grew darker, the fog thicker, and soon I found myself standing at the edge of a deserted intersection, bathed in the flickering light of a lone street lamp. And there she was, a shadowy figure standing just beneath the light, her face obscured by darkness, her presence unnervingly still. "Why have you come?" Her voice was soft, like a lullaby, but laced with something sinister. I couldn't answer. My throat felt tight, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. Who was she? What did she want from me? She stepped closer, her features coming into focus under the flickering light. Her eyes, empty, void of life, locked onto mine. "I've been waiting for you," she whispered, her smile curling unnaturally across her pale face. "You were chosen." I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, her words wrapping around me like chains, pulling me closer to something I didn't understand. Chosen for what? I finally managed to croak. Her smile widened, and in that moment, I saw something in her eyes, something dark, something unearthly. "To see the truth," she whispered, "to see how fragile your reality really is." Suddenly, the world around me twisted, bending and warping in ways that defied logic. The buildings, the streets, even the sky seemed to ripple, like a reflection in a shattered mirror. My vision blurred, and I felt the ground shift beneath me, as though I were falling into a bottomless pit. Panic surged through me as the woman's form distorted, stretching and contorting into something monstrous. Her once human face twisted into a grotesque mask of horror, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You can't run," she said, her voice now a growl that echoed through the air. "You belong to me now." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body felt like it was being pulled apart, piece by piece, reality unraveling around me. The street lamp flickered and died, plunging everything into darkness. And then I saw it, a glimpse of something far worse than any nightmare. A realm of endless shadows, where twisted figures writhed and whispered, their voices merging with the woman's. I was being drawn into their world, their reality, where there was no escape, no light, only endless torment. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was her face, grinning in the black void, her voice still whispering in my ears. "You were always mine." The phone calls never stopped. They still come every night, but now I know. I'm not just the one receiving them. I'm part of them. I'm trapped in the caller's nightmare, and I can never wake up. The party in the vacant house. It was the Saturday before Halloween, and my friends and I were scrambling for plans. Kate, always bold, posted on her Instagram looking for a party, and to our surprise, someone hit her up right away. The guy, someone we loosely knew, sent us the address for a house party in the next town over. It seemed perfect, and even though we didn't recognize the host, we figured it was worth checking out. The rules were simple. Bring your own drinks, stay inside, and at least one girl for every guy. The house was big, almost too big. When we arrived, the front yard was scattered with cars, but something felt off. There was no music until we got close to the door, and even then, it was muffled, distant. We walked in, and the house was dimly lit, orange lights giving it a spooky, eerie atmosphere. People were there, but we didn't recognize anyone. An older man greeted us. John, he said, the father of the host. He was in his 50s, much too old to be mingling with college kids at a party like this. His presence felt wrong, but he was friendly enough, offering to put our drinks in a cooler and making small talk. Still, his constant hovering around the girls felt unsettling. As the night went on, I started to feel strange. I hadn't even had that much to drink, but everything around me began to blur. My friends noticed too, pulling me aside when they saw how quickly I was fading. Kate grabbed my arm and whispered, "We need to go." Suddenly, the door swung open, and 2 police officers stormed in. Everyone froze. I couldn't think straight, but I remember John, the host's dad, slipping out through the back door as the police made their way inside. We quickly left, our heads spinning. As we drove away, we realized something else was strange. The house had no furniture. It was completely empty, save for the beer pong tables and people. The next morning, I woke up to a series of texts from an unsaved number. "You left something here," the messages read. "I'm coming to your house. Can you come to the door?" My stomach flipped. It was John. He had my number. When I told my friends, they reminded me how out of it I was at the party, how John had been all over us. And then it hit me. We never met his son. There never was a son. We went to the police, and they confirmed the house was vacant, abandoned for months. John had thrown a party there just to lure us in. I never heard from him again, but the thought of what could have happened that night still keeps me awake. The Clown at the Door Halloween 2016 started like any other. My parents were out for the evening, and I was tasked with handing out candy to the few trick-or-treaters who braved our quiet cul-de-sac. It wasn't a busy night. We lived in a dead-end neighborhood, and by 8 p.m. the streets were silent. I spent the evening catching up on homework and binging Game of Thrones. Around 9:30 p.m., long after the trick-or-treaters had stopped, the doorbell rang. Vito, my small terrier, went berserk. I sighed, figuring it was some late-night straggler. When I opened the door, I froze. Standing on the porch, framed by the dim light of our porch lamp, was a tall figure in a clown costume. His mask wasn't a cheap, goofy one. It was twisted, grotesque, the kind that makes your stomach flip. He didn't say a word, just waved slowly and pointed at the empty brown sack in his hand, as if asking for candy. Something about him felt wrong, but I didn't want to seem rude. Through the storm door, I told him we were out of candy and quickly shut the door, locking it behind me. I stayed by the door, listening. There were no footsteps. He didn't leave. Instead, the doorbell rang again. Vito barked louder this time, sensing my fear. My heart raced. Why was he still here? It wasn't a child or some harmless prank. I glanced out the side window but couldn't see him anymore. Maybe he left. I decided to head upstairs and turned off all the lights on the first floor, hoping it would make him leave. I carried Vito up with me and shut him in my room to stop his barking. I told myself it was over, that it was just some random prank, but then I heard it, snap. The latch on the storm door had been forced open. I stood at the top of the stairs, paralyzed as I heard the front door rattling, the knob turning back and forth. I scrambled to text my family, but no one replied. I was on my own. I tried calling my dad. No answer. Then my brother, who brushed it off as a Halloween prank. But it didn't feel like a prank anymore. The doorbell rang again, and I stifled a scream. Why wouldn't he leave? Minutes passed, feeling like hours. I waited, hoping it was over. Then, just as I started to relax, I heard something outside my window. It was a soft, rhythmic thump, like someone tapping on the glass. But I was on the second floor. No one could be outside my window, could they? I approached the window slowly, pulling back the blinds just an inch, and my blood ran cold. There, staring at me through the glass, was the clown. His twisted mask pressed against the window. He was holding onto a ladder, my dad's ladder, which he had taken from the backyard. I screamed, stumbling backward. I locked myself in my parents' room and dialed 911, barely able to speak through my shaking. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but it felt like hours. The police arrived, and I heard them banging on the door. I didn't come out until they called my name. They found no sign of the man, but they confirmed that he had broken the storm door latch and propped the ladder against the side of the house. I never found out who he was or what he wanted, but I still see that mask in my nightmares.
When I was around 7 or 8, Halloween was my favorite night of the year. That particular Halloween, my mom dropped me off at my friend Sean's house so I could go trick-or-treating with him and our other friend Johnny. Sean's sister, who was older and distant, was usually around, but never really acknowledged me, and I didn't think much of it. That night, though, no one was supervising us, just 3 kids running loose in the dark. At first, it was exciting. We darted from house to house, our pillowcases filling with candy, barely able to contain our laughter. The freedom felt amazing. After a few hours, Johnny had to go home, but Sean and I weren't done yet. The streets were quieter now, with fewer trick-or-treaters, and the air had turned chilly. We ventured down streets we hadn't explored yet, feeling a mix of excitement and slight unease. Then we saw him, a man pushing a stroller slowly down the sidewalk behind us. He seemed harmless enough at first, just another dad out with his kid. But as we knocked on more doors, he kept getting closer. Eventually, the man caught up to us. His voice was soft, almost sing-song, as he said, "How's the trick-or-treating going, boys?" We answered, polite but nervous. Then he made an offer that we couldn't resist. "I've got candy left at my house. You can have all of it. It's just up the street." Sean and I exchanged glances. A jackpot of candy? We couldn't say no. We followed him, and he led us deeper into the neighborhood, away from the main streets. The further we walked, the quieter it got. No lights, no people, just the sound of our footsteps echoing in the darkness. He kept talking to his stroller, whispering to the baby we assumed was inside. But something felt off. He was walking faster now, and we struggled to keep up with our heavy bags of candy. When we reached his house, it was dark. No porch light, no Halloween decorations. The man unlocked the door and pushed the stroller inside, then invited us in. Sean went first, and I hesitated. I asked if we could leave the door open. The man paused, then smiled, too wide, too forced, and said, "Of course." As he disappeared into another room, Sean stepped over to the stroller and lifted the canopy. I saw his face go pale. Without a word, he turned to me and whispered, "We need to leave. Now." We bolted out the door, our pillowcases dragging behind us as we ran. My heart pounded as we sprinted down the dark street. We didn't stop until we reached the corner. That's when a neighbor called out to us from her porch. "Do you boys know that man?" Sean, still catching his breath, told her about the stroller and how the man offered us candy. The woman's face darkened. "He doesn't have a child," she said firmly. "I've seen him before." She drove us home and we explained everything to our parents. That night the police came, but no one ever told me what they found at that house. Sean and I never spoke of it again, but I'll never forget the look on his face when he saw what was inside that stroller. Something that wasn't human. In 2014, I worked a job with unpredictable hours, often getting off work late at night. One night, I finished a shift around 3 a.m. Exhausted and starving, I stopped by the local 24-hour Walmart, hoping to grab a snack before heading home. The store was eerily quiet, its usual hustle and bustle replaced by silence, with only a handful of employees scattered around. I wandered down the snack aisle trying to decide what to get, when I suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of unease. It was that feeling when you just know someone is watching you. My skin prickled, and I slowly glanced toward the end of the aisle. Standing there, in the dimly lit aisle, was a tall, thin man wearing a black Adidas sweatshirt. He wasn't looking at the shelves or at the products. He was just standing there, staring directly at me. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe he was just zoned out or lost in thought. But something about the way he stood there motionless made my stomach twist in knots. His presence was wrong. I turned back to the shelves, pretending to browse, but I couldn't focus. My heart was beating faster, and every nerve in my body was screaming that something wasn't right. After a minute, I moved to the next aisle, hoping he would stay where he was. But as soon as I entered the new aisle, I saw him again. This time, peeking around the corner, his eyes fixed on me. My chest tightened with panic. It wasn't just my imagination. He was following me. I grabbed a random bag of trail mix and started walking toward the back of the store, hoping I could lose him. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, moving slowly, keeping a safe distance but never breaking eye contact. His face was emotionless, cold, like he was a predator stalking prey. Every step I took, he mirrored, always staying just far enough behind to make me feel like I couldn't confront him. By now, my heart was pounding in my ears, and I knew I needed to get out of there. I quickened my pace, heading toward the checkout area. But when I reached the end of the aisle, there he was again, somehow ahead of me, standing by the main walkway. He wasn't shopping. He was just watching, waiting. I pretended to ignore him and made my way to the checkout. The cashier was the only other person in sight, and as I paid for my items, I told her that someone had been following me around the store. She nodded but didn't seem to grasp the urgency in my voice. After paying, I cautiously walked toward the exit, my pulse racing. I glanced around and, to my relief, didn't see the man anywhere. Thinking I was finally free, I hurried across the parking lot to my car, which was parked a little distance from the entrance. The lot was mostly empty except for a few cars, likely belonging to employees. Just as I reached my car and unlocked the door, I heard rapid footsteps. My heart nearly stopped as I looked up. The man was sprinting toward me at full speed. His footsteps were heavy and fast, as if he was running for his life. But no, he was running for me. In that split second, my mind went blank. I stood frozen, watching him close the distance between us in terrifying speed. Then instinct kicked in. I threw open my car door, jumped in, and slammed it shut just as he was about to reach me. My hands fumbled to start the engine, and in a blind panic, I slammed the car into drive and hit the gas. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and the man was still running, chasing my car, his arms pumping furiously as if he believed he could catch me. I sped out of the parking lot, barely able to breathe, and only after I reached the main road did I look back to see the man shrinking in the distance, finally giving up. I have no idea who he was, what he wanted, or why he targeted me, but his relentless pursuit haunts me to this day. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just trying to scare me. He wanted something far worse. I never went back to that Walmart at night again. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't reacted in time.
It was a quiet evening at Walmart, around 8 p.m. The store wasn't too busy, and I was casually browsing the fitness aisle, considering a massage gun. I wasn't planning to buy one just yet, but I wanted to read up on them. As I stood there, I started hearing faint voices from the next aisle over, the toy section. I remember hearing a man's voice and the softer, more innocent voice of a child. At first, I didn't think anything of it. After all, it was the toy aisle. Parents and kids were always wandering through there. But then I overheard the man say, "I'll buy you this toy if you come with me." My stomach tightened, and my hands froze on the box I was holding. There was something unsettling in the way he said it. Too urgent, too persuasive. I still didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was just a dad using a toy as leverage to get his kid to behave. But then I heard the man say, "Your mom said it's okay." And something about the tone in his voice made my heart skip. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This didn't feel right. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the growing dread. Trying to stay calm, I casually walked out of the fitness aisle and turned into the toy aisle just to glance at the situation. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a man in a black jacket and a winter hat, holding a little girl's hand. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. He was leading her toward the end of the aisle, but something about their body language felt wrong. The girl didn't look up at him. Her steps were small, hesitant, as if she didn't fully trust him. I felt my heart race as I realized I needed to do something. But what? My mind was racing. I didn't want to accuse the man outright if he really was her father. So I grabbed the closest toy off the shelf, a stuffed animal, and called out, "Excuse me." The man turned around, and his face told me everything I needed to know. His eyes were wide with surprise, his expression stiff, like he had been caught. I approached them, pretending to ask for advice. "Do you think this would make a good gift for my niece?" I asked, trying to sound casual as my pulse thundered in my ears. He stammered, saying he wasn't sure. Then, I asked directly, "Is this your daughter?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then said, "No, I'm just watching her for the moment." His answer sent a chill down my spine. There was no warmth in his voice, no familiarity. It was robotic, rehearsed. He quickly muttered something about needing to go and started leading the girl away again. My mind was screaming at me to do something, but part of me was still second-guessing myself. Was this just a misunderstanding? I was rooted to the spot, not knowing whether to follow or call for help. As I stood there frozen, I heard a woman's voice in the distance calling out a name. "Sarah! Sarah!" Her voice was frantic but not loud, more like a desperate plea. My heart sank. The little girl's name was Sarah. I bolted toward the voice, finding a woman a few aisles away. She looked panicked, her eyes darting around. "Is Sarah your daughter?" I asked breathlessly. When she nodded, I felt my stomach drop, and I quickly explained that I had just seen her with a man. Her face went pale, and without another word, we both sprinted toward the front of the store. The dread building inside me was unbearable. We had to find her. We had to stop them before they disappeared. When we reached the self-checkout area, there they were. The man was standing at one of the machines, casually scanning an item, a toy for the little girl. Sarah stood beside him, looking confused but not resisting. The girl's mother screamed her name and everything happened so fast. The man's face contorted in panic and he tried to play it off. "I was just trying to be nice. I was going to buy her a toy," he said, but the desperation in his voice was undeniable. As soon as he realized no one was buying his story, he bolted. He ran so fast, slipping through the doors and out of sight before security even had a chance to react. The mother hugged her daughter tightly, tears streaming down her face. My legs were shaking as I watched them, relief washing over me. But my mind was racing with the possibilities of what could have happened if I hadn't intervened. Later, I found out that the man was caught not far from the store. He was arrested, but I couldn't get the thought out of my head. He was so close to disappearing with that little girl. I couldn't shake the terror of how easily it could have all gone horribly wrong. They say certain places remember, walls hold memories, and lakes hide secrets. This is the story of a weekend I'll never forget, in a lake house that held something sinister, something waiting beneath the water's surface. I had agreed to join a few friends for a weekend getaway at an old lake house one of them had inherited. The place had been in their family for generations, but no one ever stayed there. And when I saw it, I understood why. The house stood alone, its wooden frame leaning over the edge of a silent, dark lake. Thick mist clung to the water, making it feel like the lake was breathing, waiting. The place felt wrong from the start. There was an oppressive stillness, as though the house was holding its breath. The trees surrounding it seemed to reach out with gnarled branches, their leaves whispering in the wind, warning us. But my friends, oblivious to the dread that weighed on me, joked about ghost stories and headed inside. As night fell, we settled in. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional drip of water from the lake. That's when the first incident happened. I was in the kitchen when I saw something move in the reflection of the window, a dark silhouette crossing the dock, heading toward the lake. But when I turned around, there was no one there. I shook it off, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. But as I lay in bed that night, I heard footsteps creaking on the wooden floors outside my room. soft, deliberate steps. They paused right outside my door, and then silence. I held my breath, waiting, but the footsteps never continued. The next day, I walked down to the lake alone, hoping daylight would ease my growing dread. The water was unnaturally still, dark and murky, reflecting the gray sky. As I stood there, something caught my eye. A shape just beneath the surface. It looked like a figure, drifting, just out of reach. My pulse quickened, but before I could make out any details, it vanished. When I told my friends, they laughed it off. But that night, as the mist thickened around the lake, the figure reappeared, closer this time. Its outline was clearer now, unmistakably human, floating just beneath the surface. I felt a pull, an urge to reach out, to step into the water, like it wanted me there. That night, I woke to the sound of water dripping in my room. A trail of wet footprints led from the doorway to the foot of my bed. My heart raced as I followed the trail with my eyes, to find the dark, wet figure standing there, its face hidden in shadow. Water dripped from its hair, pooling on the floor, and a foul, stagnant smell filled the room. I couldn't move. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers bony and gray, as though they'd been underwater for years. When it spoke, its voice was a rasp, gurgling with water, saying only, "Why, did you come back?" I bolted from the room, screaming, waking everyone else in the house. But by the time they rushed to my room, the figure was gone. Only the wet footprints remained. We packed our things in a frenzy, desperate to leave as the first light of dawn crept over the lake. But as we drove away, I glanced back one last time. The figure stood on the dock, watching us leave, its hollow eyes locked on me, a silent promise that it would find me again if I ever dared to return. Sometimes places are abandoned for a reason. Some memories lie hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be disturbed, and once you awaken them, they'll never let you go. Everyone has that one room in their house they avoid. For Mark, it was the basement, a cold, dark place he never wanted to go, until he was forced to confront the horror lurking below. It started with a noise, a faint scratching sound, like something dragging itself across the concrete floor. Mark brushed it off, blaming it on old pipes. But night after night, the sounds grew louder, as if something was struggling to escape. One night, Mark couldn't take it any longer. He decided to go down there, armed with nothing but a flashlight. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he found the basement deathly quiet. The furniture lay draped in dust, untouched, and the silence seemed to close in around him. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the wardrobe. It stood alone in the corner, its door slightly ajar, deep claw marks etched into the wood. Mark's flashlight flickered, and for a moment he could swear he saw something shift within the darkness of the wardrobe. Mark reached for the wardrobe door, hands shaking. Just as his fingers touched the handle, a deep scratching erupted from within. He froze, unable to pull his hand away. The scratching grew louder, more violent, until with a burst, the wardrobe door swung open, revealing only darkness. But Mark felt a cold, unnatural breath brush against his face. He stumbled back, heart racing, and fled up the stairs. As he slammed the basement door shut behind him, the scratching continued, relentless and furious. And from that night on, he could never step foot in that basement again. But each night, as he tried to sleep, the scratching continued, until he could swear he heard his name, faintly, through the walls. Sometimes it's better to let things lie in the dark, hidden and forgotten. For some places hold secrets that should never be disturbed.